Hello chums, and welcome to Taming a Monster, the series where I take some of Gran Turismo 7's most ridiculous cars to see if I can tweak them so that a talentless pleb like me can handle them without being killed to death. Like any common ruffian, I'm using a bog standard PlayStation 5 controller, and I have all driver assists turned off, except for ABS. Let's see what car is trying to murder me today! Today's contender for the fastest life-ending crash competition is one I've been looking forward to for a while. The Lamborghini Countach is a car with a reputation for being utterly atrocious to drive. So, how will it fare with the L539 V12 from the Lamborghini Aventador SV? Better still, how will it fare when that engine has over 1000 horsepower? As usual, all of the upgrades are applied, including the wide body and the body rigidity increase. However, none of the settings have yet been altered, except for downforce, which is maxed, and the transmission, which has already been set up to allow this engine to stretch its legs. The Countach has aftermarket wheels that are larger than standard. Increasing the size of the wheels can increase agility, though this can come at the expense of the car's ability to take bumps or curves, and thus stability can suffer slightly. It has a front splitter for front downforce, and a custom wing set for maximum rear downforce. While the Type A Batmobile wing looks much cooler, it doesn't provide enough rear downforce to keep this car stable. If you're interested in learning more about aero, downforce, or any other aspect of tuning your car, I have a series called Tuning for Beginners which covers everything from suspension to differential to the transmission. The chosen site of my impending doom was the Barcelona GP circuit, a track that makes me depressed every time I see it. Being mid-engined, the Big Tash got a respectable launch, followed by a driving experience that surprised me, in a good way. Rather shockingly, the car exhibited almost no real negative handling characteristics. It suffers with a slightly vague front end, which leads to some understeer, but it also means that the car was already rather tame. I didn't have any moments where the car tried to bite my oversized head off. The typical body movement that you would find with default settings reared its head, but it didn't negatively affect the car's handling nearly as much as it would with other cars. Typically, my first adjustments were to increase the natural frequency and the anti-roll bars to reduce the body roll. I set the rear natural frequency lower than the front, which should slightly reduce the speed at which the Aventador will transition to oversteer on corner exit. The tighter body control made the car feel tidier, if not necessarily easier to drive. The understeer was slightly reduced since less body roll makes the car change direction more quickly. Move it, you useless wanker! However, it still mostly persisted, so this will end up being one of the few videos where I try to make the car faster instead of more drivable. Next up, I adjusted the LSD. Reducing initial torque should help with that understeer. Reducing braking sensitivity should do the same while making the brakes feel sharper. Acceleration was more or less fine, though I did reduce it slightly. Reducing acceleration sensitivity will send more power to the wheel with less grip, in other words, the inside wheel. This helps slow down the car's transition to power oversteer, which should hopefully give me more confidence in the car when exiting the corner. Honestly though, there was not a huge difference in the Countach's handling. It felt slightly more agile, and trail braking was easier. This car is truly great to drive, pretty much out of the box though. My final tweaks were to finish off the suspension. I increased compression, which usually helps the car deal with curves. I reduced camber to increase straight line traction, which should slightly reduce wheel spin as well as braking distances. I also added a tiny bit more rear toe in to help with power oversteer. While this again made a very subtle small difference, the Countach was rather a delight to drive anyway. This is one of the rare cars I drive where it's just bloody excellent from start to finish. Either way, it was now time to head to the Nordschleife to see how the Captain Toad would fare. I didn't need to make any further tweaks to the setup, though the car did have some slight lift-off oversteer on the Nurburgring's windier sections. You can improve this with front toe out, however this can cause understeer in other situations. Compared to a lot of other cars in this series, this one is still a breeze to drive. Interestingly, the Countach is only the second car in this series with a V12 engine. It's almost as if V12 cars are wonderful in every way and don't need taming as much. The Countach SV is mostly a very easy car to drive despite its power, but there's one or two ways in which it falls behind on overall pace. One of those is the brakes. The car was designed in the 1970s and then was continually updated over the next 15 years or so, gaining displacement, power, and weight. As a result, the brakes aren't really up to the task of slowing down this car when it's got double the power it came out of the factory with. The other ways in which this car loses time against the other members of the 1000 horsepower club is downforce. Other than the 911 turbo-swapped Subaru WRX and the Dodge Viper SRT10, almost all of the top 20 cars are capable of much higher downforce values than the old Lambo, which will make a very noticeable difference through the high-speed sections such as Flugplatz or Schwedenkreuz. As a result, the Countach is potentially not going to cause any major upsets on the leaderboard. None of that detracts from how nicely the car drives though. Out of the near 50 monsters I've tried to tame so far, I'd easily put this car in the top 10 as far as accessibility is concerned. Even when compared to some of the all-wheel drive contenders, they all have such a high ceiling of performance that accessing it can be a challenge in itself, whereas this car is surprisingly easy to drive at maximum attack. It also doesn't bite you nearly as badly when you make a mistake. As a result, I highly recommend it. In the end, the Countach managed a time of 6 minutes 22, a respectable time if not a particularly blistering one. It narrowly beats the RB26 swapped Skyline R31 and narrowly misses the Porsche 959 and Demon Charger. So, that was my attempt to tame a monster. I hope my settings helped, or that you enjoyed this video. Join me next time where I'm continuing to make up for the V12 deficit in this series. Thank you very much for watching, and if you're feeling particularly generous, I would greatly appreciate your subscription. Take care of yourself, and ta-ra!